Yeah, for the last hour and 41 minutes, I've been whining about how the elite and how the government have been using thought control to keep radicals like yourself out of the public limelight. Now, you're here. I don't see any CIA men waiting to drag you off. You were in the paper. That's where everyone here heard you were coming from, in the paper, and I'm sure they're going to publish your comments in the paper. Now, a lot of countries, you would have been shot for what you have done today. So what are you whining about? We are allowing you to speak, and I don't see any thought control.
First of all, I hadn't said one word about my being kept out of the limelight. The way it works here is quite different. Now, I don't think you heard what I was saying, but the way it works here is that there is a system of shaping, control, and so on, which gives a certain perception of the world. I gave one example. I'll give you sources where you can find thousands of others. And it has nothing to do with me. It has to do with marginalizing the public and ensuring that they don't get in the way of elites who are supposed to run things without interference.
Yeah, the trouble is you don't end the book by saying, I'm kind of odd in feeling this. You say, everybody is odd who doesn't agree with me, right?
No, I don't think so. Do I say that?
This is certainly the burden of your book.
I wasn't aware of that. Yeah. I mean, I think that I've given, an argument.
Well, maybe this is a universal difficulty you're having, not being aware of certain people's reading of your position.
Well, then let me say, I think for example, I think I take a very qualified and temperate position on many, many issues in this book. For example, take the issue of the background of the Second World War, which I spent a lot of time on. If you notice, I end up with a statement saying that I don't see any way to give a clear, sharp resolution, clear, sharp answer to the question what we should have done under such and such circumstances. I discussed someone who did take a very strong and I think very honorable position, namely A.J. Muste, and I say that I wish I could answer the question for myself whether I feel that I would have taken or would have rejected that position, but I don't see any way to do it because the issue is mixed. And on many issues, I feel that way. On the other hand, see, when the issue is let's say 3 million tons of bombs dropped on Vietnam, I don't feel that way anymore. Nevertheless, I'm still perfectly willing to argue the issue calmly, quietly, and
as you would have, say, the dropping of the bombs in Dresden.
Exactly, or the atom bomb, let's say. See, I would have been willing to argue the dropping the atom bomb, though I do feel that it's a war crime.
Sure, but I do think that you put some people at a disadvantage by your a priori assertion that any position that disagrees with your own is intellectually barren.
Well, I didn't mean that, really. Let me explain. Maybe it didn't come across, but what I meant was something else. I wanted to honestly state my own emotional and my own feeling about entering into a debate over this issue.
Sort of Portnoy-wise?
No, I think that the point is that I think it's only fair to an audience of readers to say this is the way I approach the issue, and you read me on the basis of this understanding the best I can give as to the way I'm approaching this issue. And it's perfectly true that when I do, if you notice what I say is that increasingly over the years in discussing this issue, I felt this feeling of emotional and moral falseness. And I think it would only be honest to express it.
Sure.
Then to go ahead with the discussion.
Oh, quite so. But you also say that you hate yourself for not having come to that position earlier.
Yeah, I do. I think that was a very great mistake.
Well, I hope to give you a little solace in the course of the evening. But the reason I do raise this, and I rejoice in your disposition to argue the Vietnam question, especially when I recognize what an act of self-control this must involve.
It does.
Sure.
It really does. I mean, I think that this is the kind of issue where sometimes I lose my temper. Maybe not tonight.
Maybe not tonight. Because if you would, I'd smash you in the goddamn face.
Let me make this point. I spoke to someone about you today, and he said the following to me. Someone who many his views you would recommend. You would agree with, some not. He said to me that after complimenting your mind, the quality of the mind, and contributions you had made, he said that what you had done is turned American exceptionalism on its back, and that you're, for all those who believed in American exceptionalism, you had believed in exactly the opposite, whatever that is. Now, let me stay with this question. On the other hand, there are people who have asked you, look, if you have such strong feelings about how wrong-headed American policy has been, why don't you leave the country? A frequent sort of thing that's thrown at people who are critical frequently. And you always say, I love this country.
Yeah, I sure do.
Right.
I mean, it's a very interesting question. Let's try it on some other country. You know, sometimes it's easier to think about things clearly if we distance ourselves.
Great.
Well, let's go back to, say, the big enemy, Soviet Union.
Right.
I mean, the Russians would have been delighted to have the dissidents leave the country. If Sakharov had been willing to come to the West, they would have applauded. Does it make sense to ask Sakharov, why don't you leave the Soviet Union? I mean, I suppose
no, I'm not trying to ask that. You understand, I'm not asking that question. I'm actually using that question to make the point that you've always said.
That's the framework in which the question should be understood.
Right.
It's assuming that you can't have a democratic society.
You stay and fight for values because you love the country.
And you think that the country ought to live up to these values. And you can't rank countries A, B, C, D. Countries have all sorts of properties. There's a culture, there's a society, there's modes of interaction, and so on. A lot of the things that are simply achievements. I mean, take, say, protection of free speech.
Right.
It's unique in the United States. There are a lot of great things that have been achieved. There are a lot of rotten things that have been done. If you have any concern about the country, meaning its people, its culture, and so on, you want to save and extend and amplify the achievements and modify the
and you would
crimes.
put the protection of free speech high up on that list.
Very high. And it's not the only one.
Okay, well, tell me more, and then we'll come to some of the criticisms that you have made about American imperialism and the like.
See, we have to make a distinction between state power and a country. They're different things.
I understand the difference.
But it's often not distinguished. If you criticize state policy, you're not criticizing a country.
I understand that too. I mean, frequently when you're traveling around the world, as I do, people say, I love, America. I'm just having a great
policy.
I hate the policy. Sure.
And we're responsible for the policy. It's a free country. We can't say, I don't have any responsibility for the policy, because we do. We may not know about it, but then we should find out about it. And if we decide we don't like it, we should change it.
Contrary to what was said here in the introduction, the New York Times, of course, did not say that you were the most important intellectual alive, and you know that well. It was merely an outsider, a professor at Stanford, who said it in a review which appeared in the New York Times. Interestingly enough, you've used that quote on several of your books, also a fabricated quote. You've also said that whenever that arises during an introduction like tonight, you always say something about it and correct it. And that's, of course, a falsehood, because you didn't do it here tonight. And that's happened in the past also. Number two, I couldn't help but notice the reference to Arthur Schlesinger. Apparently you still something sticking in your craw about your bout with him, I guess it was around 1970, in which he exposed you for fabricating some Harry Truman quotes. That was the exchange in which he dubbed you an intellectual crook. So I guess that's still sticking in your craw even now. And finally, as to this notion of cheering for the home team, which obviously you don't do, there's somebody else you're cheering for. So I'd like you to be very forthright, like some leftists do, who say they are cheering for our opponents in various places around the world, quite clearly. Do you have the courage to tell us right now that you are pulling against us in Iraq and Afghanistan, that you're hoping we fail, that you support the terrorists, or you might call them freedom fighters, hoping they kill Americans?
We get the point, yeah. Can I go through these points? On the first one, the quote, it was not by somebody interviewed, it was by a reviewer in the New York Times.
He was interviewed.
He wasn't, you said he was interviewed.
I did not say that. Listen up.
You did, but it doesn't matter.
It was a book review.
It was a book review, right. And it's true that I didn't bother to correct it tonight, but I almost always do it because it's funny. It's a very funny thing. What he actually said is, he's the most important intellectual in the world. How can you write such terrible things about U.S. foreign policy? I like that quote, so I
That's not accurate either.
invariably correct it. You say you see it on the backs of books. If you take a look at the publishing industry, you'll find that the author has absolutely no control over what appears in blurbs. Nothing. If I had a choice, I'd tell them not to use it, of course, and I often do. But they like to use it, and then I correct it when it's brought up. That's because I think the actual quote is quite interesting. So that's one. As for Schlesinger, you've got the story backwards. I criticized Schlesinger on these points in a book that appeared in 1969, which he was furious about. And in his review of that book, which was a furious review, he tried to find some error, and he found an absolutely trivial error, so small that it was corrected 2 months later in the second printing. but he's been screaming about it. He's screamed about it ever since, and people like you do too. The error was that in quoting a speech by Harry Truman, okay, instead of quoting his actual speech, I quoted a virtually verbatim paraphrase of it by a leading respected commentator, James Warburg. So the words were slightly different, though the content was exactly the same. As I say, it was so trivial, it was corrected 2 months later in the second printing. It's a rare book that doesn't have some small error. But yes, you know, the defenders of state violence are desperate, and if they can find anything that they can point to, they'll run with it forever. So that's the truth about the second point. As for the cheering, you heard what I said, and it's what I've written. I think we should pay attention to the population, okay? Population of the United States, population of Iraq, population of the world. We should pay attention to what they think. Of course, those who are, you know, supporters of state violence think we shouldn't. We should pay attention to the guys in power and to the sort of cheering section that among the intellectuals that supports them. Well, I don't agree with that. Just to take the case of Iran, I think the opinion of the American population happens to be very sound, and I support it. And the same is true in Iraq. I think the opinion of Iraqis is very sane. Last December, the Pentagon released a study of focus groups in Iraq and reported it as good news. They gave a very upbeat report. They said, contrary to what people are saying, you know, the critics, there's a lot of agreement among Iraqis, and therefore there's hope for reconciliation, okay? And then if you read down a little further, what was their agreement about? Well, there was overwhelming agreement among Iraqis that the United States is responsible for the ethnic cleansing and the sectarian violence, and that the United States should get out, okay? That's what there's agreement about. Well, yeah, I think we should pay attention to our victims. And I can go down the line if you like. Everything else you said is just pure fabrication, and you know it.
At what point does it seem too exquisitely, that you're making the perfect the enemy of the good, that you may have a criticism of the United States, but it seems trivial to the threat that posed by radical Islam? Do you feel out of balance that you should criticize perhaps America's enemies more?
No, I think the opposite. It's first of all, it's always. Let's take Iran. Okay, the duty of an Iranian dissident inside Iran is not to join the huge chorus of condemnation of the crimes of Israel in the United States, though the crimes are very real. The duty of an honest dissident, an honest, honorable person in Iran would be to criticize the crimes of Iran. And we understand that. In the old Soviet Union, we respected the dissidents, Sakharov and others, because of their criticism of the crimes, repression, violence of their own country. We didn't care what they said about the U.S. war in Vietnam. That's none of their. In fact, if they supported it, who cared? We honored them for doing what they had to do within their own countries. Same with Václav Havel. We honor him because of his struggle, his courageous struggle against repression and violence where he was. Whether the fact is that he did support U.S. crimes, but that's marginal.
Do you regard yourself as a dissident?
My case is quite different.
Are you a dissident, Professor?
Do I disagree with what does a dissident mean?
I don't know. You've been using the term.
That's an interesting term. We use the term. The term conventionally is used in the United States only for critics in enemy states. We don't call critics in the United States or its allies dissidents. That's part of a propaganda system.
What would you call yourself?
A person who gives my opinion about international domestic affairs.
Well, but there's a flavor to your opinion.
It happens to be the kind of criticism which we call dissidents in enemy states, so therefore we should call that here too, not accept the propaganda device of restricting it to enemies. We should apply it to ourselves as well. Now, I'm going to continue. I'm not comparable to the dissidents in the Soviet Union and Iran for many reasons. For one thing, they're under much harsher repression, incomparably harsher. Secondly, I do extensively condemn the crimes of enemies. They didn't, in fact, but I do. So there's many differences.
I appreciate that, and I'm glad you pointed those out. I want to ask you, because you're such a strong critic or dissident of the United States, is there a model society? Is there another country or jurisdiction that you think America should be more like? We all work towards an ideal or a utopia, but is there a manifestation of these ideals on Earth that you think America should be more like?
I don't think there's any particular society that I would, if I were, any society that I can think of, if I were living there, I'd be criticizing what its, aspects of its policies that deserve harsh criticism.
But you're more than just a grouch. You have a particular philosophy of, and I want to know if there's a place on Earth that is more attuned to your philosophy. I know you would criticize everything, and so perhaps I'd call you a critic, not a dissident. Is there a better society than America?
First of all, expressing criticism of society is not being a grouch. Václav Havel was not a grouch. Sakharov was not a grouch. They were doing something. Shirin Ebadi in Iran is not a grouch. They're doing something very significant. And they are not, and it's not just negative. You're not saying, look, stop this crime. It's also saying, live up to this ideal. For the United States, we should say, yes, we should live up to ideals that we profess. We profess a belief in democracy. Fine, we should try to live up to it. To the extent that we don't, it should be criticized, and not only just criticized, but active efforts should be made to overcome it. That's the role of, I think, any decent person. We call them dissidents in other countries, so let's call them that here.
You're very patient with me. I have two last questions. You mentioned the ideals that all Americans are striving to live up to, and which will probably never be met.
I didn't say which we claim to be living.
We claim to be. Thank you. You're very precise in your language, and I should be more precise in my characterization of you. Are America's ideals themselves noble, or do you object to America's ideals as, say, expressed in the Constitution? Do you believe that the American Constitution is an idealistic document that we should work towards and strive towards?
The U.S. Constitution had positive elements and quite negative elements. So, for example, one part of the Constitution authorized the capture and return of slaves to their owners. Well, fortunately, many years later, that was overcome. There are other things in the Constitution that I think are quite admirable. There are others that should be changed.
You say the war is simply an obscenity, a depraved act by weak and miserable men.
Including all of us, including myself, well, including that's the next sentence, same sentence.
Sure, because you count everybody in the company of the guilty.
I think that's true in this case.
Yeah, but
see, one of the points I was
this is a sense of theological observation, isn't it?
No, I don't think so.
Because as somebody points out, if everybody's guilty of everything, then nobody's guilty of anything.
No, I don't. Well, no, I don't believe that. See, I think the point that I'm trying to make, and I think ought to be made, is that the real, at least to me, I say this elsewhere in the book, what seems to me a very, in a sense, terrifying aspect of our society and other societies is the equanimity and the detachment with which sane, reasonable, sensible people can observe such events. I think that's more terrifying than the occasional Hitler or LeMay or other that crops up. These people would not be able to operate were it not for this apathy and equanimity. And therefore I think that it's, in some sense, the sane and reasonable and tolerant people who share a very serious burden of guilt that they very easily throw on the shoulders of others who seem more extreme and more violent.
No, I agree, but surely the emotional temperature of yourself or of myself or of other people is not in and of itself an index an automatic index to the righteousness
Certainly
of our
not.
emotions.
Certainly not.
As
I
we
wouldn't
know, for
mean it to be
instance,
intended.
people were approximately equally wrought up in the late 30s over whether or not America should help the Western powers to defend themselves against the Axis powers. And I think it is incorrect to suppose that people of either side were necessarily right simply because they were exercised.
Oh, I'd agree with that totally.
Yeah.
There's no connection whatsoever between
whatsoever,
you know,
yeah.
degree of emotion and degree of correctness.
But as you understand the existing situation, it ought to be, in your judgment, a transparently evil thing that we are engaged in, and you are derivatively concerned because there isn't, because there is not a shared sense of indignation like
right.
your own.
Now, I don't say that I am right because I am indignant. Rather, I say that I think in this case I am right to be indignant, which is different. I have to prove that.
You are right to be indignant if you are right.
That's right, and that has to be demonstrated. That's why
that
I
has to
have
be demonstrated, which
you
is
know,
why we're
dozens
here.
of pages of argument about
Sure.
it, which may or may not convince people, convinces
Sure.
me. Yeah.
Sure.
You say that what the media do is to ignore certain kinds of atrocities that are committed by us and our friends, and to play up enormously atrocities that are committed by them and our enemies. And you posit, in fact, you say in the Massey Lectures that there's a test of integrity and moral honesty, which is to have a kind of equality of treatment of corpses.
Equality of principles.
I mean, that every dead person should be in principle equal to every other dead person.
That's not what I say at all.
Well, I'm glad that's not what you say, because in fact, that's not what you do.
Of course it's not what I do, nor would I say it.
That's right.
In fact, I say the opposite. What I say is that we should be responsible for our own actions primarily. That's something quite different.
But it isn't, but
I wasn't equating them, I was comparing the treatment of them. If you want my value judgment, we should give much more attention to one priest who we've killed than to 100 priests that they've killed. Notice that this is exactly the... That's exactly my method.
Because your method is to ignore, is not so much not only to ignore the corpses created by them, but also to ignore corpses that are created by neither side, but which are irrelevant to your ideological
That's
agenda.
totally untrue.
Well, let me give you an example. One of your own causes that you take very seriously is the cause of the Palestinians, and a Palestinian corpse weighs very heavily on your conscience, and yet a Kurdish corpse does not.
That's not true at all. I've been involved in Kurdish support groups for years. That's absolutely true. It's absolutely false. I mean, just ask the Kurdish, ask the people who are involved in, I mean, you know, they come to me, I sign their petitions and so on and so forth. And in fact, if you look at the things we've written, I mean, take a look. I mean, I'm not Amnesty International. I can't do everything. I'm a single person. But if you read, say, take a look, say, at the book that Edward Herman and I wrote on this topic. We wrote a book about this in 1979. In it, we discuss three kinds of atrocities, not two, three kinds of bloodbaths. What we called benign bloodbaths, which nobody cares about, constructive bloodbaths, which are the ones we like, and nefarious bloodbaths, which are the ones that the bad guys do. Constructive bloodbaths are things like the Indonesian massacres, which we supported. Nefarious bloodbaths are like Pol Pot. But we also discussed ones that nobody cares about, like Burundi. For example, we have probably the only discussion in the literature, I guess, of the massacres that were going on in Burundi at that time. We probably have the only discussion in the literature, at least that I know of the massacres that are going on in Burma. You know? Now, you know, in fact, not only is what you say not true, but it's the opposite of the truth. We went out of our way to find the kinds of bloodbaths that are just ignored because nobody cares about them. Now, again, let me stress, I'm not Amnesty International. I do not have I don't have the ludicrous egotism which makes me the arbiter of all atrocities over the world, right? I'm not trying to give an A to this country and a B minus to this country and so on. The principle that I think we ought to follow is not the one that you stated. It's the principle that we rightly expect Soviet dissidents to follow. Okay, what principle do we expect Sakharov to follow, let's say? What lets us decide whether Sakharov's a moral person? I think he is. Sakharov does not treat every corpse does not treat every atrocity as identical. He has nothing to say about American atrocities. And when he's asked, he says, I don't know anything about them, I don't care about them. What he talks about is Soviet atrocities, and that's right, because those are the ones that he's responsible for. Just as in, you know, it's a very simple ethical point. You're responsible for the predictable consequences of your actions. You're not responsible for the predictable consequences of somebody else's actions. Now, we understand this when we're talking about dissidents in the Soviet Union, okay? But we refuse to understand it when we're talking about ourselves for very good reasons. Commissars in the Soviet Union don't understand it about dissidents. Commissars in the Soviet Union attacked Sakharov and other dissidents because they don't talk about American crimes, right? We understand exactly why that's just hypocrisy and cynicism when they do it, and we should understand the same when we do it. Now, the fact of the matter is that I spend a fair amount of effort on crimes of official enemies. There are a fair number of people in the United States and Canada from the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe who are there because of my personal activities on their behalf. But I don't take any pride in that particularly. I just do it because I'm interested in it. The most important thing for me and for you is to think about the consequences of your actions. What can you affect? Those are the ones you primarily ought to be concerned about. Of course, every corpse is a corpse, but there's some that you can affect and there are others you can't do much about. You know, like I can be worried about things that happened in the 18th century, but I can't do much about them.
You can't stand on a high moral mountain and suggest that somehow shame should come down to them because they are likewise hand-wringing because of the complexity that existed prior to American involvement in World War II.
Well, I'm sorry, but no one proposed going to war against Hitler. No one in high places. And in fact, the State Department, right up until 1937, was saying, yeah, we got to support Hitler as the moderate. I mean, we can talk, you know, we can talk about what should have happened, but let's separate it from what did happen.
All right.
Now, in this case, or in the case of Hitler, or in much more crucial cases, like the case of Vietnam or Central America, much more crucial because we could do something about it, what you ask is, are there policies that I can, in conscience, recommend because of their likely beneficial human consequences? That's what a moral person does if he's going to be consistent. Now, in the case of, say, Vietnam, in the case of atrocities carried out by our own state or client states, there are almost always things to do straight off. In the case of atrocities carried out by some enemy state or some, you know, let's say Sri Lanka, some place that we just have no serious connection with, very often there just isn't a lot that you can do. You can pontificate about it, but you can't suggest things that will help. Now, in the case of Yugoslavia, what you have to ask, if you care about the people, if you care about the human beings, not your own, you know, sort of preening your feathers, then you ask, what are the likely human consequences, say, for the people of Yugoslavia or the region, if we do X?
Right.
And you have to ask, well, what are those consequences? So let's say, suppose somebody proposes an American invasion of Serbia, okay? Then we ask, well, what are the likely consequences? Or let's say a UN invasion.
Yeah.
Then we say, well, what are the likely consequences? Well, I mentioned some of the possible ones, and they're not very pretty. In fact, they might end up, and are likely to end up, harming the people much more. So therefore, if you want, you can pontificate. You can say, look, what a great moral figure I am. I think we should do X, Y, and Z. But that's not being a moral human being. A moral human being is someone who's, what are the consequences of what I'm recommending?
Mm-hmm. So you separate yourself from, for example, Anthony Lewis of the New York Times.
Well, if he had a proposal, I would be
he wants
interested.
to, among other things, provide helicopter air-to-surface artillery against gun emplacements surrounding Sarajevo.
He wants to provide arms to the Bosnians, I believe.
Well, I think allowing them
You've
to get
already
armed,
given the green light to that, I'm understanding.
I mean, I think that's a plausible proposal.
Right.
Whether helicopter gunships could silence the guns is something that Anthony Lewis doesn't know and that I don't know. And you have to find that out before you make the proposal. See, it's all very well to say, well, let's call in helicopter gunships to stop the guns. Will it do it? Well, I don't know, and he doesn't know.
Or will it escalate it to the next level?
In fact, is it even technically possible?
I mean, there are
he doesn't know and I don't know.
If they shoot down the gun,
Yeah.
the helicopters, then what are you going to do?
Yeah.
Come out with...
Or suppose that that does incite a segments of the Russian military to simply move down there and force. Is that what you want?
Well, if I were shepherding my grandchild across an open area of downtown Sarajevo where all the trees have been chopped down so that my loved ones can have some heat at night, and bullets are whizzing by me and other mortar shells being launched at me, a civilian, and my child from a hill in Sarajevo, I'd be a little impatient at the propensity on the part of otherwise very leading, courageous social critics to sit around and wonder what the consequences of this will be.
Really?
If we sat around and wondered what the consequences would be,
Really?
For example, well, you're going to take.
I mean, suppose that first of all, the people in Sarajevo are not calling for armed intervention. Secondly, suppose that they think it through. It's not very hard to think and say, well, there are missiles being shot at me. Well, the answer is they wouldn't. And we have to ask whether the actions that are sometimes mindlessly being proposed might have that consequence.
You asked us after September 11, one of your points is we ought to look in the mirror, we being America or the West, we ought to look in the mirror at our own. Was that a way of saying, look, people like bin Laden are angry at us for good reason?
No,
in other words, is there a way to justify...
That's not what I was saying. The statement of mine that you just quoted is a very conservative statement. In fact, it was articulated by George Bush's favorite philosopher, Jesus Christ, who pointed out, famously, defined the notion hypocrite. A hypocrite is a person who focuses on the other fellow's crimes and refuses to look at his own. That's the definition of hypocrite by George Bush's favorite philosopher. When I repeat that, I'm not taking a radical position. I'm taking a position which is just elementary morality.
But even if he is a hypocrite, and
even not he, everyone.
Okay, even
Can
if...
you, let me ask another question. See, here's an experiment. Try to find a phrase in the massive commentary on September 11th which is not hypocritical in the sense of George Bush's favorite philosopher. Find one phrase.
All right, but before,
I don't think you can do it.
Okay, but before, I don't want to get Gnostic here and religious on it, but I do want to...
This is not religion. This is elementary morality. If people cannot rise to the level of applying to ourselves the same standards we apply to others, they have no right to talk about right and wrong or good and evil.
But let's talk about even in right. And look, there's nobody pure, but an argument has been made. I know that the U.S. has committed atrocities. However, they did oust a more brutal regime, the Taliban. There
wasn't even a war aim. There wasn't even a war aim. Wasn't even a war aim.
But is that a moral thing to do? They did get rid of a brutal regime. There was celebration in Canada. Now,
good, fine. Let them bomb Israel and get rid of the brutal regime there. Let them bomb Uzbekistan and get rid of the brutal regime there.
You say the Taliban and the Israeli government are the same?
No, they're not the same. They're brutal regimes. But let's go back a stage. The goal was not to oust the Taliban. That was not a war aim. That was a war aim that was picked up several weeks after the bombing started. Okay? And let's go back. Suppose that and there are dozens of, long list of brutal regimes around the world which ought to be overthrown, but not by somebody bombing them. However, let's go back to the late October, when after 3 weeks of bombing, when the U.S. and its British client decided to shift the war aims to overthrowing the Taliban regime. There was a meeting sponsored by the United States in Peshawar, Pakistan, of 1,000 Afghan leaders. They unanimously condemned the bombing and said it was undermining their efforts, which they thought could succeed, to overthrow the Taliban regime from within. The U.S. is doing it just to show off their muscle.
All right, now
so the question of whether to overthrow a regime, yeah, that arises. And I think the Afghans are right. Regimes should be overthrown from within, and in this case it was probably very likely that that would succeed. It was a small, brutal group, highly unpopular, plenty of opposition to it, which could have been organized from within, and that's the way to overthrow a regime. If we want to overthrow the regime of Uzbekistan, now a great favorite, but it happens to be not very different from the Taliban, the way to do it would not be to bomb Uzbekistan, but to support internal democratic forces and let them do it. And that generalizes around the world.
Now, if the press is a censoring organization, tell me how that works. You're not suggesting that proprietors phone one another up, or that many journalists get their copy spiked, as we say?
It's actually, Orwell, you may recall, has an essay called Literary Censorship in England, which was supposed to be the introduction to Animal Farm, except that it never appeared, in which he points out, look, I'm writing about a totalitarian society, but in free democratic England, it's not all that different.
And then he says unpopular ideas can be silenced without any force. And then he gives a two-sentence response, which is not very profound, but captures it. He says two reasons. First, the press is owned by wealthy men who have every interest in not having certain things appear. But second, the whole educational system, from the beginning on through, just gets you to understand that there are certain things you just don't say.
America gets, mainstream media gives essentially the same message because why?
Why the same?
Yeah.
Well, we have to look what the message is. First of all, the message is one of remarkable subordination to power. Now, power in the United States doesn't happen to be in the state. It's not a centralized military bureaucratic state like in the Soviet Union.
Right.
Power in the United States primarily lies in corporations, in the corporate world. There's very narrow concentration of control over resources, over investment decisions, and so on and so forth. And that affects everything. You can't help affecting everything. It affects the government, because this means that there's a very close link between governmental power and corporate power. Furthermore, just the ability to make investment decisions and financial decisions places bounds on what any government could do.
Yes.
Furthermore, now let's go to the major media. What are the major media? Well, they're huge corporations. Okay, the New York Times, Washington Post, NBC, they first of all are large corporations, quite profitable ones, in fact. Secondly, they're parts of even bigger conglomerates, like, Westinghouse and GE and so on. Now, like any corporation, they sell a product on a market. This is a market, roughly a kind of a state-guided market society. What's the product and what's the market? Well, the market's advertisers. That is, other businesses. So they're selling a product to other businesses. Corporations are selling a product to other businesses. What's the product? Well, the product is audiences. Now, for the major media, the ones that kind of set the agenda, they're selling elite audiences, privileged audiences. The New York Times, say, is targeting privileged elite sectors of the population. That's their audience, and they're trying to sell that audience to other businesses. Now, so we have to begin with, just on the most elementary grounds, we look at a system. Suppose we're Martians. We're looking at this system. We say, okay, here are huge corporations selling privileged audiences to other businesses. Well, what picture of the world do you expect to come out of that? Then we begin to add other factors. If let's say you're the chief diplomatic correspondent of the New York Times, or a pundit on the op-ed page, and you want to really have important, insights into the government. Well, we all know how that's done. You have lunch with the Secretary of State. He tells you the lies that he wants to appear tomorrow. You write them and you say, a high source in Washington, my intrepid reporting has discovered that a high source in Washington said so-and-so. In fact, if you compare the internal declassified record, of, say, people like Dean Acheson's decisions, and you look at, say, James Reston's columns, they're pretty close. And the same will be true about James Baker and Thomas Friedman. And furthermore, this is an open secret. We know that this is the way. It's not a big secret in the journalistic profession that this is. Now, in order to maintain those contacts, you better present the world a certain way, or those contacts are going to be cut off. You'll lose your opportunity to have to appear, to have special insight, to have leaks, to be able to come across with a story, a couple hours before the next person, and so on. Plus, now, in order, there's an interplay here which requires power in order to maintain your own power. That's another factor over and above the just structural and institutional properties.
Go along, you get along.
Okay, let's look at one of the other key examples, which you've looked at too, which would appear to go against your idea, which is the Watergate.
Watergate is a perfect example. We've discussed it at length in our book, in fact, and elsewhere. It's a perfect example of the way the press was subordinated to power.
But this brought down the president.
Let me give you just a minute. Let's take a look. What happened there, here it's kind of interesting, because you can't do experiments in history, but here history was kind enough to set one up for us. The Watergate exposures happened to take place at exactly the same time as another set of exposures, namely the exposures of COINTELPRO.
Oh, sorry, you have to explain that.
It's interesting that I have to explain it because it's vastly more significant than Watergate. That already makes my point. COINTELPRO was a program of subversion carried out not by a couple of petty crooks, but by the National Political Police, the FBI, under 4 administrations. It began in the late Eisenhower administration, ran up till...
This is aimed at the Socialist Workers' Party of America.
The Socialist Workers' Party was one tiny fragment of it. It began, by the time it got through, I won't run through the whole story, it was aimed at the entire New Left, at the women's movement, at the whole black movement. It was extremely broad. Its actions went as far as political assassination. Now, what's the difference between the two? Very clear. In Watergate, Richard Nixon went after half of U.S. private power, namely the Democratic Party, and power can defend itself. So therefore, that's a scandal. He didn't do nothing happened. Look, I was on Nixon's enemies list. I didn't even know. Nothing ever happened.
But nonetheless, you wouldn't say it was an insignificant event.
No, it was a case where half of U.S. power defended itself against a person who had obviously stepped out of line. And the fact that the press thought that was important shows that they think powerful people ought to be able to defend themselves. Now, whether there was a question of principle involved happens to be easily checked in this case. One tiny part of the COINTELPRO program was itself far more significant in terms of principle than all of Watergate. And if you look at the whole program, I mean, it's not even a discussion. But you have to ask me what COINTELPRO is. You know what Watergate is. There couldn't be a more dramatic example of the subordination of the educated opinion to power here in England as well as in the United States.
I have to ask you something. For many years in the Soviet Union, that expression, lapdog, wasn't the emperor's lapdog, it was the imperious lapdog, the lapdog of whatever.
To whom were they referring?
To bourgeois newspapers, which would of course include the New York Times and the Washington Post and all the others. It kind of jars me to hear that same terminology used by a man like yourself. Now, you obviously you think about what you're saying. Would you care to qualify that when you call the New York Times a lapdog of the emperor who has no...
Well, for example, I would not compare the New York Times to the party hacks who wrote for Pravda. Certainly, for various reasons. For one thing, it's more diverse and it's more independent, and it's certainly not under anything like the same government pressure. On the other hand, if you look at the output, there are often remarkable similarities. And in fact, one of the differences between totalitarian states and free societies is that in totalitarian states, when the commissar class, shines the shoes of the people in power, they can at least plead fear. They can say, look, I'm afraid, I can't do anything else. In free societies, you can't plead fear, you can only plead cowardice. That's a difference, too.
Go ahead. Well, let me just, in the Soviet Union, the media were controlled. And we all knew it. There was a department in the Central Committee of the Communist Party called the Department of Agitation Propaganda, later just a propaganda department, and you got your orders. This is what you're going to say about this. How you say it is your business, but this is the line. And every single publication in the country, every single television, every single radio, they followed this line. They were all controlled. But the way you tend to portray the press in this country, at least the mainstream press, seems to be pretty similar. It looks like they're all doing the same thing, and they're all controlled some way.
Well, they have to distinguish this.
Right.
In fact, they're all doing the same thing pretty much, but they're not controlled the same way. There are many different mechanisms that can lead to similar consequences. First of all, again, let me stress the consequences aren't identical. The variety in the United States is considerably greater, and the independence is certainly greater. The mechanisms of control are totally different. The mechanisms of control, if you want to call it that, in the United States are a kind of guided free market. People they're responding to pressures that have to do with concentration of power and concentration of resources and need for advancement and so on and so forth. And you can spell these things out, they're not very subtle. But what's interesting is the uniformity of the consequence.
This is what I don't get, because it suggests that, I'm a journalist, people like me are self-censoring.
No, not self-censoring. There's a filtering system that starts in kindergarten and goes all the way through. And it doesn't work 100%, but it's pretty effective. It selects for obedience and subordination. And especially, I think that
so stroppy people won't make it to positions of influence.
Behavior problems, or if you read applications to a graduate school, you see that people will tell you he's not, doesn't get along too well with his colleagues. You know how to interpret those things.
I'm just interested in this because I was brought up, like a lot of people, probably post-Watergate film and so on, to believe that journalism was a crusading craft and that there were a lot of disputatious, stroppy, difficult people in journalism. And I have to say, I think I know some of them.
Well, I know some of the best and best-known investigative reporters in the United States. I won't mention names because I don't want to, whose attitude toward the media is much more cynical than mine. In fact, they regard the media as a sham, and they know and they consciously talk about how they try to play it like a violin. If they see a little opening, they'll try to squeeze something in that ordinarily wouldn't make it through. And it's perfectly true that I'm sure you're speaking for the majority of journalists who are trained, have it driven into their heads that this is a crusading profession, adversarial, we stand up against power, a very self-serving view. On the other hand, in my opinion, I hate to make a value judgment, but the better journalists, and in fact the ones who are often regarded as the best journalists, have quite a different picture, and I think a very realistic one.
How can you know that I'm self-censoring? How can you know that journalists
I don't say you're self-censoring. I'm sure you believe everything you're saying. But what I'm saying is if you believe something different, you wouldn't be sitting where you're sitting.
Tom Wolfe.
This is the old cabal theory that somewhere there's a room with a baize-covered desk, and there are a bunch of capitalists sitting around, and they're pulling strings. These rooms don't exist. I mean, I hate to tell Noam Chomsky this. You don't share that. I think it is the most absolute rubbish I've ever heard. This is the current fashion in universities. You know, it's patent nonsense, and I think it's nothing but a fashion. It's a way that intellectuals have of feeling like a clergy. I mean, there has to be something wrong.
Well, I actually agree with that comment. I mean, the idea that there would be a high cabal running things in a country like the United States is idiotic. That would say it is like the Soviet Union. It's totally different, which is precisely why I say the exact opposite. What I'm talking about, it's like saying the corporations try to maximize profit and market share. That's not a conspiracy. That's the institutional structure of the system. Individual decisions lead to that consequence of trying to maximize profit and market share. You don't do it, you're out of business. That's not a conspiracy, and it's not a high cabal. Now, why does Wolfe, or whoever it was, hear this as being a conspiracy? The point is that any analytic commentary on the institutional structure of the country is so threatening to the commissar class, they can't even hear the words.
Is he part of the commissar class, Tom Wolfe?
Yeah. I mean, he can't even hear the words. So if I say there is no high cabal, what he hears is there is a high cabal.
But don't you think the reason he can't hear the words is because he believes profoundly in the things he's been taught, that this is democracy, that there is freedom. It's like a lot of people like myself who used to be members of the Communist Party and who profoundly believed in the ideals and very painfully let go. Don't you think that there are a lot of honest people, Tom Wolfe being one of them, who profoundly believes in this, and he's not a member of the commissar class, he just has his ideals.
Yeah, but you see, what you're...
And you're threatening, you threaten those ideals.
But see, what you're describing in the Soviet Union is what I would call the commissar class. That is, the people who profoundly believed. I'm sure, you know, I don't know people...
Average people.
Average people,
Right.
but also all the way up to the editors of Pravda. If you did an in-depth analysis with them, how many of them would be total cynics?
Not many.
Yeah, that's right, because most of them completely believe. That's the way systems work. In fact, if you have, I mean, the way belief systems form, really, if you think about it, is, you know, we even know this from our personal lives. You sort of decide to do something for whatever reason, and then you create a system of beliefs that justifies it and says, yeah, I was right. Well, the end effect of this is that people who function within a system of power and authority, whether it's an editor of Pravda or an op-ed writer for the Times or a concentration camp guard or, you know, pick across the board, they're usually quite sincere about it. And they have worked up a system of beliefs which says, yes, this is just and right, and I'm completely free and independent. If they couldn't have that system of beliefs, they couldn't continue. Now, the point is but I think when you point out that, I agree with you when you say it's a tight, closed system of beliefs. It's a kind of fundamentalism, which means you simply cannot hear critical analysis. And it's interesting to see what in the United States can't be heard. Ordinary institutional analysis which says this is the way institutions function in a guided free market system given the distribution of power without any control, no control, nobody's given orders and so on. This is the way it functions because of the way power is distributed. That's much too threatening to listen to, just as it's too threatening to hear the words, the United States attacked South Vietnam.
If we are prepared to agree that it is not always easy to taxonomize military action into that which is terroristic and that which is purely a military operation, we are left with doubts, for instance, about the bombing of Germany in 1942, 43, 44. Mm-hmm. You might contend that this was terroristic and unnecessary, and you might be right, although you're not a military expert, neither am I. But I think
there's a point to that.
Yeah, but I do judge that even if we all agree that what we did in Dresden was inexcusable, as a moral question, it's got to be understood in context of what was it that brought us to Dresden in the first instance.
Absolutely.
And what brought us to South Vietnam in the first instance, in my judgment, was clearly an uninterested, or I should say disinterested, concern for the stability and possibilities of a region of the world.
What period do you feel that we had this disinterested relationship to Vietnam?
Right now.
No, at what period did we have it? Did it begin? Let's say 1951, for example, when the State Department bulletin points out that we must help the French reconquer their former colony, and we must eradicate all Vietnamese resistance down to its last roots in order to reestablish the French in power. Was that disinterested?
To increase my vulnerability, I wish we had helped the French.
We did. We supported them.
Not sufficiently. Well, but there's no point in helping somebody insufficiently.
It was hardly disinterested when we attempted, as with tremendous support, in fact, to reinstate French imperialism in South Vietnam.
Now, it was disinterested in this sense, and I think this is an important distinction which you do touch on in your book. It's a disinterested act if my attempt to help, or your attempt to help a particular nation, is in order to spare you the possibility of a great ordeal in the future, which will harm you, your family, your children, your republic.
And in that sense, Nazi Germany was also disinterested.
Yeah,
after all, Nazi Germany was conquering Eastern Europe only in order to advance the values of Christian spiritual civilization and to restore the Slavs to their rightful home and so on and so forth. Totally disinterested.
Look, I follow you. But if you want me to pursue that digression, I will.
Okay.
But let's suspend it for a moment. Okay. I'm distinguishing that kind of disinterestedness between the kind of...
But that's not a kind of disinterestedness. You see, that's something which includes as a special case every case of military aggression and colonialism in history. It's all disinterested in your sense.
Well, all right, let me simply rest my case by saying that there is an observable distinction by intelligent men between a country that reaches out and interferes with the affairs of another country because it has reason to believe that a failure to do so will result in universal misery, and that country which reaches out and interferes with another country because it wants to establish Coca-Cola plants there and chase national banks and whatever and exploit it. Now, that is an observable
It's a conceptual distinction. Well, let's distinguish between a conceptual distinction and a factual
I'm prepared to
distinction.
do that.
All right, it is a conceptual distinction, but in actual fact, the history of colonialism shows that these two motivations can coincide. That is, practically every, I mean, there are exceptions, probably the Belgians and the Congo are an exception, but by and large, the major imperialist ventures have been in the economic, in the material interest or in the perceived material interest.
I'm not interested in the mathematics of the, I'm interested.
Let me finish.
You have already conceded that it's not merely a conceptual difference.
I say it is.
There are exceptions.
There are a few exceptions.
All right.
Like say
okay. But let's talk about the exceptions then.
Well, no, but the exceptions are at the difference. No, wait a minute. The exceptions. I mentioned, for example, the Belgians and the Congo. There, they didn't even pretend to have a civilizing mission. There, it was pure material self-interest. These are the exceptions. There are, as far as I know, no exceptions on the other side. There are. I mean, maybe I've left out a case of history, but as I see the history of colonialism, the great mass of cases are cases where a powerful country was working in its perceived material self-interest and was covering what it was doing to itself and to the world with very pleasant phrases about preserving Christian values or helping the poor benighted natives or one thing or another. Now, there are a few exceptions where there was pure predatory imperialism. not even any pretense of doing anything, but these are quite rare.
Kaplan says that there is a distinction. That everyone's got some blood on their hands, but he says, we have significantly less blood because what we are is a soft imperialist, not state terrorist.
So like when we supported his example, Ceausescu in Romania, right to the end, that's good. How about killing several million people in Vietnam? How about killing hundreds of thousands of people in Central America in the 80s, leaving 4 countries devastated beyond, maybe beyond recovery?
Qualify the U.S. from their intervening in any other way?
Look, nor does it disqualify the fact that bin Laden is a terrorist, or that, say, the Taliban are a terrorist state, that fact doesn't disqualify them from bombing Washington. What disqualifies from doing that is even if they were Mahatma Gandhi, they shouldn't do it. Kaplans can't understand trivialities. The triviality here is that nobody except the ultra-right-wing jingoists like Kaplan is comparing atrocities by various countries. What honest people are saying, this seems to be incomprehensible, is that we should keep to the elementary moral level of the Gospels. We should pay attention to our own crimes and stop committing them. This would be true even if we were killing one person. Okay, and it's even more true when we're killing millions of people.
Let's bring it to the bigger picture then, just because the question, he says, we all agree with the Gospels. This is, and then
he doesn't.
But he says, look, I believe in a Hobbesian world. This is what he says.
So is he saying we should overthrow
it's nasty. If you leave people alone, they'll kill each other. Yeah. And that's why what you need, was he calls, is an organizing hegemon, an overweening power,
which is always us.
Yeah, which is always us, he says.
Right, because and why is it us? Because we have the power. And we have a massively subservient intellectual class, of which he's an illustration, which will support U.S. atrocities no matter how awful they are.
But he says this is real politics, that Chomsky's off in another land with his gospel, that he says, look...
Forget gospel, I'm talking about the most elementary morality. If a person doesn't understand that, they have no right to talk. Okay? If you don't understand that you pay attention to your own crimes, you have no right to talk.
He talks about Machiavellian virtue. Sometimes we do a bad thing to protect our democratic and our good institutions and a just society.
Yes, now how are we protecting our democratic institutions by supporting mass slaughter in southeastern Turkey in the last few years? Was that supporting our democratic institutions?
Was it supporting...
Our democratic institutions?
Not ours, but...
Anybody?
Would Kaplan argue that the nation-state has a right to use any means necessary to protect its sovereignty?
Oh, then he's justifying Milosevic. He's saying Milosevic had the right to do anything he wanted to repress the Kosovars in Albania. Is that what he's saying?
Do we need a constabulary, a force, a central force? In this case, it's America because it's the superpower, to sometimes use unjust means in the service of just causes.
What are the just causes? What was the just cause in, for example, slaughtering Kurds in southeastern Turkey? What was the just cause? What was the just cause in supporting Suharto when he killed a couple 100,000 landless peasants in Indonesia, went on to become one of the biggest torturers in the world, and then slaughtered a third of the population of East Timor? What was the just cause? What was the just cause when we invaded South Vietnam 40 years ago? This is the 40th anniversary of the public announcement of the U.S. attack on South Vietnam, ending up killing millions of people, leaving the country devastated. They're still dying from chemical warfare. What was the just cause? What was the just cause when we fought a war, to a large extent, against the Catholic Church in Central America in the 1980s, killing hundreds of thousands of people, every imaginable kind of torture and devastation? What was the just cause? Can I continue? Yeah, the just cause for people like Kaplan is we did it. Therefore, it's a just cause. You can read that in the Nazi archives, too.
You say nothing can justify crimes such as those of September the 11th.
Mm-hmm.
But then you say we can think of the U.S. as an innocent victim only if we adopt the conventional path of ignoring the record of its actions and those of its allies. So it's not, U.S. is not an innocent victim.
There are no innocent
according to you.
There are no
so it's a guilty
victims.
Victim. It's a guilty victim.
Like every victim.
So it had
in the
this
world.
coming to it.
No, that's your inference. The fact
but that's the inference that people get from reading what you've said.
If they are totally irrational. If we're rational.
A lot of irrational people out there.
I can't help that.
if we're rational, we will recognize that the United States, Britain, France, and I can go down a long list, have a terrible record of atrocities, and that does not justify violent acts against them.
But you seem to see this moral equivalence the whole
There's
time
no
between
moral-
bin Laden and Bush, don't you?
Moral equivalence is a term of propaganda that was invented to try to prevent us from looking at what the acts for which we are responsible.
You say there
I
are plenty of
reject
bin
that
Ladens on both sides.
Pardon?
You say there are plenty of bin Ladens,
Oh, there are bin Ladens all over the world.
on both sides.
There are
That's
plenty of
moral equivalence.
No,
That's a polemic,
it's
isn't it?
not moral equivalence. There is no such notion. There are many different dimensions and criteria. For example, there's no moral equivalence between the bombing of the World Trade Center and the destruction of Nicaragua or of El Salvador, of Guatemala. The latter were far worse by any criterion. So there's no moral equivalence. Furthermore, they were done for different reasons, and they were done in different ways. There's all sorts of dimensions.
But why, when the U.S. is considering what to do about this, do you always go back to past?
Not past,
crimes,
present.
Well,
Present.
you mentioned Nicaragua.
I mentioned that because it's uncontroversial, since there's a World Court and Security Council resolution. But I can take cases, since it's uncontroversial, that's a good example. I mentioned these cases.
Are you kicking the U.S. when it's down?
No, I'm asking that we accept the definition of hypocrite given in the Gospels. I think that's correct. The hypocrite is the person who refuses to apply to himself the standards he applies to others. I don't think we should be hypocrites.
To what aim do you do this? To what aim do you wish to point this out?
Because I think we should try to rise to the level of minimal moral integrity. Once we can rise to the level of minimal moral integrity, then we can discuss these issues seriously. If we can't even rise to that level, there's any point to talking. Minimal moral integrity requires that if we think something is wrong when they do it, it's wrong when we do it. Pure predatory imperialism?
Sure, the history of the Roman Empire.
Well, let's take one. Since the Industrial Revolution.
Since the Industrial Revolution. Well,
No,
if you say that people have refined the art of apologetics, I don't deny it. But it is also true, and I think manifestly true, that there have been interferences with the affairs of other nations whose purposes were, in my judgment, manifestly benign.
For example?
Well, for instance, the Truman Doctrine.
Oh, I don't think that was manifestly benign at all. That was an attempt to
well, the Greeks
develop an
benign. I think the
Greek situation was benign, not at all. We were
I say the Greeks' testimony is more interesting to me than yours.
Which Greek testimony?
The testimony
of the thousands of people who were thrown into jail and.
Well, I grant not the testimony of the Greek communists who were beaten.
Or the Greek peasants who were.
Well, there again, is it a conceptual difference that between the person who desires a life under some kind of freedom and one who desires life under some kind of under communism?
No, because there's no such opposition in Greece. There was a distinction between a very repressive regime which we instituted in 1946 and another regime, I don't know what it would have been, that would have grown out of a victory of the so-called communists. Now, if you see, what we did had nothing to do with freedom. What we instituted was
This is absolute historical romantic, I would say, because
the
number of people who were slaughtered in Greece, first by the communist insurgency, then by the Nazis, then again by the communists, add up to an enormous
communist insurgency before the Nazis? Which one?
Not insurgency, conquest.
Communist conquest before the Nazis in
communist
Greece?
Insurgency.
Prior to the Nazis in Greece?
Yes, the Civil War of the early 40s.
My point is that the Greeks... your history is quite confused there. There was no communist insurgency prior to the Nazis. There were communist resistance bands that fought against the Nazis.
This is a matter of nomenclature. The point is that the 40-year-old or the 45-year-old Greek has fought 3 times in certain ventures, in one of which they acknowledged that we bailed them out.
Who is they? The rulers of Greece acknowledge that.
No, also the people.
Oh, I'm quite unaware of that. I'm quite unaware that the people of Greece have spoken on this issue.
Even Papandreou, you like him, I assume, because he hates us.
No, not at all.
Papandreou.
Not at all. George Papandreou was one of the people who was.
I'm talking about Andrea, which makes it even.
Is Andreas Papandreou?
They're both on record as being grateful to President Truman for his intervention in that part of the world in 1947.
In that case, I disagree with him on that issue. I mean, I really think we had no right to intervene in Greece in 1947.
No, now we're talking about rights.
And
which
I
gets
don't
us away
think
from
that
the
in any...
which gets us away from the discussion.
All right, let's talk about let's talk about
The
whether we
discussion
did
is
it
whether
for
or not there is such a thing as relatively disinterested international interference. And it seems to me that America's record is rather good. We went through an imperialist phase, but we pulled out of it faster than any country in the history of civilization.
I think we're very deep.
Why did we
right
pull out of the
moment.
Philippines, for instance?
We pulled out of the Philippines because it became a bad investment.
Why?
Because if you look, American agricultural interests were very much opposed to the, back in the mid-30s, they were very strongly opposed to the free trade relationships which allowed Philippine crops to compete with them. That's why we pulled out of the Philippines.
Why do these agricultural interests authorize us to intervene in South Vietnam?
Well, they did.
If you consider this is
because we didn't intervene on the
basis. This is the critical dimension.
No, I say that in the Philippines it was the critical dimension. Look, the world is a complex place.
I'm aware of
there
that.
are certain interests that were involved.
MIT is a complex place.
Well, there were certain interests that were involved in our Philippine venture. There are different interests that are involved in our Vietnam venture. You see, our Vietnam. Don't forget that with the Second World War, America's imperial interests expanded enormously. I mean, prior to the Second World War, we were sort of a marginal imperialist power, except for the Monroe Doctrine. But since the Second World War, we became the world's major imperialist power. And Vietnam is simply one piece of an attempt to construct a very large integrated world system, of which Greece was another piece.
Noam Chomsky is professor of linguistics at MIT and has been active in the peace movement. Professor Chomsky, why did Daniel Ellsberg do what he did?
Dan Ellsberg released to the American people information, historical information, about how a series of presidents enmeshed them in a vicious and costly war of aggression. He had every reason to believe that this war was continuing and would continue at the present incredible level of violence. And he hoped, I hope correctly, that if this historical information were brought to the American people, they would do something about it and stop that war.
May he in fact have had a duty to disclose the information?
I think he definitely had a duty, perhaps not a legal duty, but certainly a moral duty to bring to the public evidence about criminal acts, and that's in effect what the Pentagon Papers reveal. They are a history of a criminal conspiracy operating in secret to enmesh us in this war of aggression.
We're told that one of the harms of releasing the papers, though we aren't told exactly what, is harm to ongoing negotiations. Could that possibly be true?
Well, I don't recall, of course I haven't seen the full documents, but I don't recall a single instance in the documents that deals with ongoing negotiations. There is material, very interesting material about negotiations. For example, the documents reveal in 1964 that there was a concerted effort by the executive branch of the government to avoid negotiations which they called premature, because they knew that if negotiations took place at that time, and if there were a peaceful settlement, then the client government that they had instituted and were maintaining by force in South Vietnam could not maintain itself. So therefore they violated their legal obligation to avoid the threat and use of force and to pursue negotiations and other legal means. And they said, no, we have to act in such a way as to put off every negotiation effort. And we have to first, for example, William Bundy on August 11th, 1964 said, we first have to make sure they're hurting. We first have to apply the use of force. And then maybe after we've hurt them badly enough, then we can go to negotiations.
We've heard that Dan Ellsberg's disclosure of these documents may have an inhibiting effect on similar confidential planning in the future. Is that something we should be afraid of?
I hope that it does have such an impact. If there is planning going on about engaging the United States in criminal acts of aggression, I think that information should be brought to the American public, where the right people to know about it and the right people to stop it.
Thank you, Professor Chomsky.
All right, Mr. Presser.
Mr. Chomsky, just to put your own views in the picture a little bit, in your book, American Power and the New Mandarins, you say that Americans should struggle to, and I'm quoting directly, to remove the heavy Yankee boot from the necks of oppressed peoples throughout the world.
Definitely.
That's your opinion.
Absolutely.
This is your notion of what the United States is doing, putting the heavy Yankee boot on the necks of oppressed peoples around the world.
Many such cases.
Certainly make it understandable why you feel the way you do. Would you favor prosecuting a person who avoided the draft in protest against the Vietnam War?
Certainly not. I've always supported draft resistance and will
What
continue
about
to.
a person who deserted?
No, I think that deserters should be supported.
What
in
about
fact, anyone who is resisting this illegal
What
war
about
should be
people who
supported.
destroy military files or ROTC property as a protest against the war?
Well, when you get to destruction, that becomes more ambiguous, but in many instances I would support
In many instances you would.
Yes.
What
I
about
wouldn't do it,
people
but I
who
would
would
support it.
derail a troop train?
Oh, that's even more difficult, because at that point
They're getting more difficult.
That's right, and there is no, I should say that you're not going to find any general principle that applies to this case. You have to deal with each particular instance. No, you have to deal with each particular instance on its merits.
Well, I'm dealing with this one. How about derailing a troop train?
No, I wouldn't do that, because of the injury to the individuals.
Suppose nobody were injured.
If you could be certain in advance that no one would be injured, then I think it would be all right.
Derail the troop train also.
For example, I would derail a train that was carrying live ammunition to be dropped on the people of Vietnam.
What about Ellsberg if he had distributed the 4 volumes he withheld? Would you have prosecuted him for doing that?
I have no idea what's in those 4 volumes.
I see. Yeah, well, the implication from Mr. Miller was that this was the really hotly packed secured stuff.
We have no, that's not the implication, because he has no idea what's in those
Miller
volumes
has no
either.
more idea than you do. You're quite right, yes. Should Ellsberg have revealed this material, assuming it was security matters having to do with ongoing operations affecting the Vietnam War?
That depends entirely on what the social consequences would be of revealing that information.
And who would determine that?
Well, in the case of very serious criminal acts, such as the act of, say, killing, maiming, and driving from their homes half the population of Vietnam, I think any American citizen has the right to make that decision.
Ellsberg himself is the one who would have to make the decision. Right?
Yes, because we're dealing with very significant and ongoing criminal actions.
What if an opponent of Mr. Nixon's new initiatives toward Red China, somebody who opposed it, let's say a right-winger in the government, leaked classified documents that went back and forth, we may assume, preparing it, and that this getting into the hands of a hostile press had derailed those negotiations? Would you consider that such a person should be prosecuted?
I don't think he should be prosecuted, but I would certainly oppose what he had done.
Why would you not prosecute him, sir?
Because I'd be very cautious and careful about prosecuting people for bringing information to the public.
Supposing, though, that it harmed or effectively ruined that policy at that delicate moment?
I think that would be very unfortunate, and I can conceive of circumstances under which prosecution would be legitimate, but not
what
the
if
ones
Otto,
you described.
but not in any case in this one. What if Otto Otepka had leaked his classified documents to the press rather than to the Congress? I think a rather important distinction.
Well, not entirely, because don't forget that Ellsberg did bring the material to the Congress for a year and a half before. Yes,
but that's where Otepka stopped and Ellsberg didn't.
Because
what if he had gone to the press?
That would have again been extremely unfortunate, but I agree with the other witnesses that he should not have been prosecuted.
You would not prosecute. Is there?
I wouldn't have
what if
rewarded him with
Ellsberg
doubling his
had
salary.
stolen the documents and sold them to newspapers simply for the cash involved?
Well, then I think you might argue that there was an element of robbery or something of that sort.
No, I'm not talking about robbery. The robbery is a specific crime, and you can commit it whatever your intention in the particular case.
Oh no, well,
I want to know if he had merely cash on his mind, should he be prosecuted?
I think at that point he could probably be prosecuted.
In other words,
for the trivial,
test.
Just a minute, for the trivial and a very different act of robbery.
The test.
I think we have time for one more question.
The test then is motive. Two-part question.
Motive and consequences.
And Senator McCarthy's motives, were they pure enough? So
no, Senator McCarthy's motives were quite evil, and in fact,
all a question of good and evil.
Absolutely.
And you and Ellsberg determine which.
No,
is
I
which.
think that's something for every American citizen to determine for himself.
I think it's for the government.
He should determine it by looking at the content of these papers
and our laws.
Professor Chomsky, thank you.
Yesterday you said that in the last, I think it's 20 or 30 years, the standard of living for 80% of this country has been either stagnant or declining. And today you said that the powerful know what is going on. Do you think that all of the 20% at the top understand what is going on, the big picture that you present in your books? And if not, is there any hope that a significant portion of those people can learn what is going on and develop a conscience and join with those who are trying to change things?
Well, you know, I can't say everybody knows what's going on, but it's like what I was just what you just described is completely open and public. I mean, I'm not giving you any news. You know, this is all over the newspapers. If you want real details, I mean, the place to look for details is every 2 years there's a big study that comes out called State of Working America. The edition for 1996 just came out. I think it's called 1996-97. It's edited by Lawrence Michel and Jared Bernstein, a couple of others. And that's like a huge statistical compendium that has all of this data in it if you really want it. But this basic story is known by everyone. You can read it. I mean, it's known by anyone who wants to bother to know. I mean, maybe you don't want to bother to know. But it's all perfectly public information, right in the mainstream, you know, completely obvious. It's not interpreted the way I interpreted it. It's interpreted as the mysterious workings of you know, the market and its wisdom and so on and so forth. I mean, there's all kind of phrases for it. There's nothing much to do with the market. It's very definite social policy. Do the people who are involved know what they're doing? Well, I mean, of course they do. Take, say, Newt Gingrich this morning, okay? This morning you read the newspapers, I mean, even USA Today, you know, I happened to pick up USA Today in the hotel, you know, place where they serve coffee. So there's an editorial. USA Today is not a big radical rag. Okay, they have an editorial pointing out the obvious. You know, the obvious. I mean, to anybody who has one gray cell functioning. Newt Gingrich made a speech yesterday in which he called for cutting off capital gains taxes and estate taxes. Well, who benefits by eliminating capital gains taxes and estate taxes? Well, the top 1% of the population, overwhelmingly. Then, you know, tiny effect going down. I mean, the editors of USA Today are perfectly aware of that. They're also aware, they may not, if they're aware of it, they didn't say it, but they may not be. They say, well, Gingrich also has a statement in which he says, well, this is really important because that'll free up more funds for investment. Well, you know, I don't know if he reads like exotic journals like Business Week, but if he does, he or maybe somebody in his staff knows that the business world in the United States has a big problem now, what Business Week calls a vexing problem. They have about $680 billion of liquid assets that they don't know what to do with. You know? And that's a vexing problem for companies like Intel and Ford and, you know, GE and a bunch of others that they list. So therefore, the solution is to free that. Apparently, that 2/3 of $1 trillion won't do for investment funds, so we have to give them some more money for investment funds. Meanwhile, cutting down food stamps for hungry children. You know, not if you ask the people know this, well, you know, it's pretty hard to answer. If they don't know it, it's even worse than if they do know it, because it is so obvious. It is so on the surface. You know, you don't have to look at any hidden document. You don't even have to bother reading below the headlines. You know, so yeah, if you want to know it, you know it. But I think the way you put the question is mistaken. At least I think, for the reasons I mentioned. They know it, and it doesn't make sense to ask them to join with other people to try to change it. They're the ones who are implementing it and benefiting it from it, not because they're bad people, because that's the way the institutions work. If they weren't doing it, somebody, it's like suppose you convinced the CEO of General Electric that he shouldn't be doing that. He should be a voice for the voiceless. He should be organizing in the slums. And suppose he agrees with you. He said, okay, I'm going to organize in the slums. What happens to General Electric? Does it change? No. Somebody else is appointed CEO, and it continues to increase profit and market share, because that's the institutional role, and it's got to do that. So trying to convince these people, look, to go down to speak to Newt Gingrich and say, hey, look, here's what you're doing. He knows that. I mean, Newt Gingrich knows, certainly, that he holds the national championship in bringing federal subsidies to his rich constituents. He knows that. Certainly he knows that, just as the editors of the New York Times know it. And they don't report it, but they know it. To be precise, he's actually third. For suburban counties in the country, the top federal subsidies go to Arlington, Virginia, which is part of Washington, so that's where the Pentagon is and so on. So it's part of the federal government. The second one is Brevard County, Florida, which is the home of the Kennedy Space Center, so that's part of the federal government. But as soon as you step out of the federal government, Cobb County, Georgia, is the chief recipient. And he's determined to make sure that his rich constituents keep in their cycle of dependency. He understands that. There's no point telling him. They can therefore talk about their conservative values and their entrepreneurial this and that while they're getting more federal subsidies than anyone else in the country. Okay. Now he knows that. There's no point going down and telling him. There's no point going to the newsroom of the editor of the New York Times, or for that matter the Star Tribune, and telling them, because they know it too. If they decide not to report it, that's their business, but they certainly know it. Okay. So what's the point of telling them? It's for precisely this reason that I think that the slogan of Speak Truth to Power, though I admire the people, is the wrong idea. They're not the people to whom you want to speak truth, and in fact you don't want to speak to anyone. But that's not the way to direct one's actions. It's exactly the way that Rutilio Grande and Eugene Debs and Archbishop Romero and others were saying. That's the way to do it. It's the only way that's ever worked in history, by working with the powerless.
Yeah, I'd just like you to comment on, well, this is an observation. I think probably the people who most buy the necessary illusions are probably the ones who would be most surprised to be considered in the bewildered herds. Like people who feel that they're educated, probably make $56,000 a year, etc. My take on things is that marginalized groups don't buy the necessary illusions, and their jargon and everything else reflects that. Could you comment on how you think their role could be, you know, the role of marginalized groups in the United States?
And remember, the marginalized groups is the large majority of the population.
Fragmented, yeah.
I mean, fragmented, but to put them together, that's the overwhelming majority. I think your point is right. I mean, it's kind of hard to prove because the polls don't ask the right questions, but my impression is exactly like yours, that the educated part of the population is the most indoctrinated and the most deluded. And I think there are good reasons for that. I mean, they're the ones who are subjected to the indoctrination regularly on a daily basis. To be educated means to be bombarded with propaganda, distortion, illusions all the time. For most of the population, you see what's in your lives, and you can't be deluded about the things I've just been talking about because it's right in front of your nose. You know, and you're not bombarded by the regular propaganda because you're considered too unimportant. You're just pushed to the side. So what can these people do? Well, they can create exactly the crisis of democracy that elites are worried about. They can become organized. They can enter the political arena. They can begin to, they can take over the political system by their numbers, as they should. And in fact, they can take over the system of production as well. After all, why do you need bosses and managers? What role do they serve, other than to enrich themselves and to distort the process of production for the interests of the wealthy? That's it. Let's face it. And there's no other need for them. And as long as you have, there's no law of nature that says that the people in a factory can't run the factory. In fact, they can do it better than the manager. They know better what's going on, and so on and so forth. Now, you know, when those issues become on the agenda, you'll have a real crisis of democracy, and in fact, you'll complete the revolutions that began in the 18th century and then were cut off.
Just thinking about the cause of the divisions in society, what is creating these divisions, do you think the traditional classes, working class, the capitalist class, the owners and the workers, is that the most interesting division? Is that a good way of thinking about it these days, do you think, or is it out of date now?
Well, first of all, either you give orders or you take orders, and that's a big difference. That's always a difference. Either you own large parts of the world, or you rent yourself,
or is it more complicated?
Or you rent yourself to the owners.
Maybe you own a little bit because you have a pension fund, or
well, you don't own anything. What you own is a minuscule fraction of the ownership of corporations. Stock ownership is very highly concentrated. And not only concentrated, but interlocked. So big banks own big pieces of different corporations and so on. Furthermore, if you look at ownership of the world economy is now, in many ways, a more dramatic index of a country's power than the traditional ones like GDP per capita. So, for example, there's a few studies that have just begun of the extent to which, say, ownership of the world economy is concentrated in particular countries. Turns out that U.S. corporations own about half the world economy.
But someone who owns the U.S. corporations, I mean, it's institutions who have multiple owners.
They don't have. Again, there's a very high concentration of ownership, and the institutions are, and if you go back to the enough ownership to actually control the corporation. It's often a group of big financial institutions and so on.
Some have said that the divide now is a more cultural one between metropolitan internationalists, comfortable with immigration. They're called people who are happy anywhere, and people who are rooted in local communities and who are lodged somewhere. Is that not a fair?
There are plenty of divides. There's divides on religion, for example. There's divides on all sorts of things. But a fundamental divide is the class divide. And one of the reasons for the anger that you began with is because none of the institutions and none of the political parties are really representing the class interests of the large part of the workforce. And that does lead to great anger. There are other sources too, and I think in many ways the derivative from it. So, for example, the anti-immigrant hysteria in the United States, in England, elsewhere, is in part a reflection of the decline in opportunity that is the result of the neoliberal programs. When you have a large part of the population who have been either stagnant or declining, in fact, a majority, for a generation, that's quite serious. It shows up even in mortality. So, for example, in the United States, as you may have seen recently, in the main working years, 25 to 50, roughly those years, there's actually an increase in mortality among white working people. That hasn't happened in industrial societies ever, except for famine or war.
There's been increasing standards of living in America, and isn't that in one way like a justification for it, why it's still around, why capitalism, from my understanding, has triumphed and it's still strong?
No, it's not. I don't think so. I mean, there was rising standards of living in slave societies. Slaves were much better off in the early 19th century than in the early 18th century. Is that an argument for slavery?
Well,
it's a terrible argument, I mean, any system, in fact, you could give that argument for Stalinism. There was very substantial economic growth in the Soviet Union. It's the second world, not the third. It was, until 1989, it was the second world, not the third world. Now it's back in the third world because it's undergoing capitalist reforms. Something you're not allowed to say, incidentally, but if you read, you'll notice. They've had 10 years of capitalist reforms which have driven them right back into the third world where they came from. Okay? But if you just look at it in terms of economic growth, it was reasonably successful. That's exactly what bothered Western leaders. If you read the documentary record, right up to the 1960s, where it sort of runs dry at the moment, you find that the great concern was that the Soviet Union was presenting itself as a model for modernization within a single generation. And that was raising all sorts of trouble, not only in the third world, but even in the rich countries. They didn't care about Russian aggression. What they cared about, or Stalin's terror or anything, didn't bother anybody. In fact, Truman admired Stalin. Thought he's an honest man. To deal with him and so on. He said he didn't care what happens in Russia, and so on. But the same with Churchill, incidentally, who was defending Stalin in cabinet meetings as a great man, and so on and so forth. They kill as many people as they want. That's irrelevant. The problem was, then they never expected them to be attacking anybody. But what they were afraid of was the economic growth, which was, especially in the third world, considered quite impressive. Actually, the same is true of Cuba. The documents have just been released, and they're interesting. The documents that came out not long ago from the early 60s bear directly on this question. Arthur Schlesinger was the head of the Latin American mission of the incoming Kennedy administration, which was laying out, talking about the problems and the plans for Cuba. And there he explains what troublemaking in the hemisphere means and what the Soviet connection means. He said, the problem with Castro, he said, is I'm quoting, the spread of the Castro idea of taking matters into your own hands.
okay, which he said has great appeal to people in Latin America, most of whom live in terrific poverty and oppression and are trying to find a more decent life. And with the model of Cuba in front of them, they're likely to do all sorts of things. So that's Castro's troublemaking in the hemisphere. What's the Soviet connection? Well, the Soviet connection, he said, is that in the background, the Soviet Union is presenting itself as a model for modernization in a single generation. Okay, that's the Soviet connection. Well, yeah, so therefore we have to overthrow the government because of that kind of troublemaking and that kind of connection. And in fact, that extends much more broadly, you know. Kennedy and Macmillan, in their discussions in the early 60s, were worried about the, the potential for economic growth of the Soviet Union and what it would imply. Same was true of Dulles. Same goes right back to 1917. So the facts are the opposite of what you're describing.
Perhaps my question could be put a little differently. If this system is so bad and everything, why hasn't there been? Excuse me.
Our system.
Our system. It's so bad. Why hasn't there been greater movements to challenge it?
Oh, it's been challenged all the time. I mean, we have for example, we have a very violent labor history. Hundreds of American workers were being killed right into the late 30s. Finally, they got labor rights. There has been a very extensive challenge through the 50s. In the 60s, the whole thing blew up. And in fact, many concessions had to be made. And it still continues. I mean, we right now happen to be in a period of regression, but as I say, it's cyclic. You know, there was much more regression in the 1920s when labor was really crushed. So yes, there's always challenge and struggle. But when you say, is the system so bad, I don't even know what that means. I mean, slave societies went on for centuries and centuries without any challenge. Okay? Did that justify them? And in fact, if you really want to be serious about it, the slave owners were giving arguments rather like yours. So slavery, very much like it. Read, say, George Fitzhugh, who was the leading spokesman for the American, slave owners in the South. At the time when it was becoming a serious issue, like around the 1840s, he had pretty powerful arguments in favor of slavery. What he was saying is, look, the reason you Northerners are against slavery is because you're anti-Negro racists. We are not racists. We think that you should take care of your subjects. So we treat them nicely. And we even do that on economic grounds because they're our capital. You know, like if I make an anachronistic analogy, if I buy a car and you rent a car, okay, and somebody comes a year later and has a look at the two cars, which car is going to be in better shape? Okay, well, mine, because I own it, so I'm going to take care of it. Not yours, because you rent it, and you can just throw it away and get another one, okay? That's exactly Fitzhugh's argument. He says, look, we own people, you just rent them. So therefore, we take care of them. We treat them well, we respect them, they're our capital, besides we have human relations with them, we're pre-capitalist, we still have human relations. You just treat them as tools under wage slavery, and they're much worse off. So we're the ones who are moral, you're the ones who are immoral. And in fact, under the slave system, if you take a look, it was reasonably efficient. Conditions were sort of improving. People lived better, slaves lived better in 1850 than in 1750. Okay, everything you're saying could stand as a perfectly good, not only could be a good argument for slavery, but was offered as an argument for slavery. Similar arguments were given for Bolshevism, or take, say, fascism. I mean, why was Hitler so popular? Hitler was the most, through the 30s, Hitler was the most popular leader probably in German history. Well, the reason is he carried out a social revolution. People were living a lot better. I mean, like not everybody, not Jews, for example, but Germans were living a lot better. It was very successful. Hitler either understood or, figured out, or his advisors did, that large-scale state expenditures could rescue a morbid capital economy from destruction, pretty much what American business learned during the Second World War, and he was doing it. And it was, the economy was booming, people were better off, and so on. Is that an argument for fascism? No.
given that even years before the war, the Democrats, just like you, Professor Chomsky, supported UN sanctions against Iraq, which claimed the lives of millions of children. Given that even the most left-wing Democrats, like Maxine Waters, for example, that you had raised, and also like you, Professor Chomsky, don't oppose this racist system of capitalism outright, but rather seek a more rational and enlightened form of imperialism. And given that the masters of the Democratic Party, just like the Republicans, are the capitalists, why have you come out and lined up behind Kerry saying that small differences between Bush and Kerry can lead to very different outcomes? Now, I am with the Spartacus League, and unlike you, we fight for class struggle against imperialism.
I'm sorry, but
we fight
I'm
to
going
build
ask
a
you to get to the
multiracial
question,
working
please.
class party that will fight for socialist revolution. And if you care to find the truth in a newspaper, a working class perspective that takes a side with the workers and tells the truth, check out Workers' Vanguard.
Good idea. First of all these things you said are given are false, and you can easily find that out. Second, everything you said that was given is false. Secondly, did I support the sanctions? I strongly oppose the sanctions. I'm sure I opposed them far more strongly than you did. Yeah, look, you had your say. Anyone who wants to find out can. Anyone who wants to check can. Anyone who wants to check can find out. I was bitterly condemning the sanctions, the massacres, and so on, all through the 90s. You can find that out very easily. One point you said is correct. There is small differences in a very powerful system can have large outcomes. If the Spartacus League cared about working people, poor people, people elsewhere in the world who suffer and so on, they would care about the large outcomes that follow from those small differences. If you don't care about what happens to those people and you want to live in some abstract seminar somewhere, then you don't care. But it's a fact, and we can't deny it.
What worries me is what's going to happen in this country. Obama raised such exaggerated expectations, such great hopes in people, precisely because he was an unknown. I recall reading that a Peruvian peasant was asked why he voted for a particular candidate for presidency. He said, because I know nothing about him. And I'm afraid that's what happened in this country. People voted for Obama because they knew nothing about what he really was going to carry out. And it's a very dangerous situation when you raise exaggerated high hopes and then you dash them down. We know what happened in France after 1968. De Gaulle came back to power with a vengeance. The Labour Party disappointed people in England in the 60s, and the Thatcher regime came in. Yeah. Carter disappointed people in this country, and we got Reagan. What's going to happen, as it seems to be starting right now, when this exaggerated hopes are dashed down? Do we have real dangers here, and how can we fight that?
Yeah, you're quite right. And in fact, Obama and his campaign managers made sure you would know nothing about him, or very little about him. I mean, if you look back at the campaign, the slogans were hope and change. What hope for what? You know, what change? Well, at that point, it kind of evaporates. Why hope and change? Well, you know, campaign managers are intelligent enough to read polls, and they knew that 80% of the population thought the country's going in the wrong direction. Okay, hope and change. In fact, those were McCain's slogans too, except he didn't do it as well. Obama made it primarily because the financial institutions, who have enormous power in the country, mainly thanks to Reagan and Clinton, they preferred him to McCain. So they poured money into the Obama campaign way beyond McCain, and that's the core of the funding. And yes, he managed to make it, you know, over to win the election. And it shouldn't come to us as a surprise to anyone who knows anything about American political history that they're being paid off. Just take a look at the front pages every day. The big problem for the big banks now is that the profits and the bonuses are so high that they're getting a bad press. You know, so they have to figure out some way to conceal it by, say, taking them in stocks instead of money. So you're kind of borrowing money from the public instead of stealing it, you know. So sure, they're getting paid off for having put Obama in office. But the other programs are, well, you know what's happening to them. He's probably a nice man, I don't know. But there shouldn't, just as you said, there should be no surprise. They were very careful to keep it quiet. And that's characteristic of U.S. elections. The U.S. elections are a facade. They are run by the public relations industry, who market candidates the same way they market toothpaste and lifestyle drugs. I mean, when you see an ad on television, you know you're not supposed to believe it. You know, it's not an attempt to inform you the way it would be in a market system. It's a way to create uninformed consumers who will make irrational choices, exactly the opposite of what you're taught in an economics class about markets. But business spends huge amounts of money to undermine markets by constructing uninformed consumers who are supposed to make irrational choices. And the same institutions, PR institutions, run the campaigns. And they market candidates the same way. They want an uninformed electorate that'll make irrational choices. And in fact, as maybe you know, Obama won an award from the advertising industry for the best marketing campaign of 2008. He beat out Apple Computer. And if you read the business press, executives were euphoric. They said, you know, it's the best we've done since Reagan, when we were able to market him. Now we have an even better achievement. It's going to change the atmosphere in corporate boardrooms, you know, new ways of behaving and portraying ourselves and so on. Yeah, that's the case. And one technique is, if you really want to create an uninformed electorate, you have to keep issues off the agenda. And there's a second reason for that. On issues, both of the political parties are commonly well to the right of the population. So it's important to keep issues off the table, make sure people don't know what they are. So yeah, you're quite right. And what will the result likely be? And my suspicion is an erosion of the base for the Obama campaign, because people will be disillusioned. They shouldn't be, but they will be, and it's understandable. And a very significant backlash. There's a huge group of people in the country who feel they have serious grievances. The grievances go back to the 1970s. The shift of the economy from production to finance, which is a huge shift that took place primarily under Reagan and then Clinton, and of course Bush even more extreme. And that's left a lot of people out in the cold. Majority of the population have seen their wages and incomes stagnate for 30 years. Their benefits decline, you know, services decline, infrastructure collapse, and so on. And they're not happy about it. And they want to know, why is this happening to me? If you listen to talk radio, you get a good sense of it, which I do. When I drive, I listen. The standard person is saying something like, you know, I've done everything right. I'm a hardworking, decent, white Christian. I've done everything right. Why is this happening to me? Well, who's going to give them an answer? They're not going to get an answer from the Republican Party saying, yeah, that's the policies we designed to shaft you and enrich a couple of rich people. And they're not going to get an answer from the Democratic Party saying, well, that's pretty much our policy too, except maybe not as extreme. So they get an answer from Rush Limbaugh and Glenn Beck, who tell them, well, I got an answer. It's the rich liberals who own the banks and run the government and own the media and don't care about you people, the flyover people. They only care about the rich folk and on the two coasts. They want to give everything away to illegal immigrants and, you know, the unworthy poor and so on. So yeah, that's your problem. Well, you know, if that's the only answer you're going to get, people are likely to believe it. And we had experiences like this. It's unfortunately reminiscent of late Weimar Germany.
where there also were people with grievances. And they were getting an answer, crazy answer, horrible answer, but happened to take over with consequences we know about. I'm not saying that's going to happen here, but the similarities are not insignificant.
There's a lot of anger in the world today. Are you sympathetic to that anger, or are you feeling this anger is the wrong kind of anger?
I am sympathetic to the roots of the anger. I think anger is not a constructive response to problems that are quite real, and they are quite real. So take, say, the United States, which has suffered less from the policies of the last generation than other Western countries. But nevertheless, in the United States, median income, for example, is lower in real terms than it was 30 years ago. Right at the moment before the great crash, the peak of euphoria about the wonderful economy, real wages for American workers were lower than they had been in 1979 before the neoliberal period began. And this is duplicated over much of the world. This has been a massive assault on large parts of the population. It's been an assault on democracy, on a sense of participating. The result is not just anger, but contempt for institutions, decline of centrist institutions, which a large part of the population feels are just not responsive to them correctly.
And Trump has been the result of that, you would
Trump is one result of that.
Right.
Brexit is a result of that. Le Pen is a result.
And why do you think the response to the problem you've talked about of low incomes, why do people then jump to a Le Pen or a Trump rather than to Bernie Sanders or to the solution you would advocate?
They jump to Bernie Sanders. The most remarkable thing about the last election was actually Bernie Sanders, not Trump. Bernie Sanders broke with a century of American political history. In American elections back to the late 19th century, elections are basically bought, literally. You can predict with remarkable accuracy electability simply on the basis of campaign funding and also policies. There's very substantial political science research on this. Sanders came along, no support from the corporate sector, no support from the wealthy. The media simply dismissed him as ridiculous. He was basically unknown. He even used a scare word, socialist. And he would have won the Democratic nomination if it hadn't been for the shenanigans of the party managers. If you take a look at popularity today, he is far and away the most popular figure in the American political system.
Right. But the truth is, Trump won the election, fair or not fair. What was the appeal of Trump? Why do so many people, particularly blue-collar, Rust Belt populations, why do they like him?
I've just given you the answer. Take a look at what's happened to them during
the
neoliberal.
But why Trump? I mean,
what is the alternative? The Democrats gave up on the working class 40 years ago. That's just the working class is not their constituency. No one is their. No one in the political system is. The Republicans claim to be, but they're basically their class enemy. However, they can appeal to people on the basis of non-economic claims about we're going to help you economically even when we kick you in the face, but claims about religion, white supremacy, a range of kind of what's called sometimes identity politics, which does a lot of. You take a look at the Trump voters. Some are working class, and incidentally, many of them voted for Obama in 2008. They believed Obama's rhetoric about hope and change. They were quickly disillusioned. There was no hope and there was no change. And in response, they've turned, this group has turned to basically their class enemy. because no one else is there to offer them anything.
Huge number of followers and supporters, but your views don't resonate on Main Street, mainstream America. Why is that?
First of all, they don't resonate in National Public Radio, the New York Times, and so on. But if Main Street means the people of the country, when I go home at night, I'll have 20 invitations on email to come anywhere. I speak at community groups, immigrant groups, labor groups. I've spoken at West Point. I mean, there's a very large number of people.
Be that as it may, I mean, my contention is this, that you would like to believe that the American public is more sort of left inclined than its leaders, its power system. But I would put to you that Americans are fundamentally a conservative people.
I'm conservative too. In fact, I don't express my opinion. There's massive evidence on people's attitudes. And on social and political issues, it's rather consistently, both political parties are well to the right of the population. Healthcare is one example, but the same is true on international issues and so on.
Maybe, if that's the case, and the public, you say, is behind many of the positions you hold, maybe the reason that the public isn't necessarily giving full voice to support for you is that they find it difficult to live with some of the things you say about the United States. And your critics say that you consistently exaggerate the crimes committed, as you call them, crimes committed by the United States, and you airbrush away the failings of America's enemies.
And the facts are the opposite. I underestimate U.S. and British crimes, and I overestimate the crimes of enemies.
Well, let's take an example. I mean, back in 16,
let me go back to one statement. You said the reason the American people don't vote for my position, they don't have that option, even if they knew what it was. That's not one of the options. The system is designed so that you have two choices within business-run systems, and the choices are a little different, and sometimes it makes sense to pick one rather than the other. And both choices happen to be off the main spectrum of American opinion on many crucial issues. So there's no choice.
Do you think Trump will do much damage while he's there? And will it be permanent damage to the institutions of the US? Or do you think he'll be temporary phase?
The main damage he'll do is to the world, and it's already happening. The most significant aspect of the Trump election, and it's not just Trump, it's the whole Republican Party, is their departing from the rest of the world on climate change. It's a crucial issue. It's an existential threat. And now the United States, we have this astonishing spectacle of the United States alone in the world, not only refusing to participate in efforts to deal with climate change, but trying dedicated to undermining them. And it's not just Trump. Every single Republican leader is the same. It goes down to the local levels. Take a look at the primaries. In the Republican primaries, every single candidate either denied that climate change is happening, or when you get to the so-called moderates like Jeb Bush and Kasich, they said, well, maybe it's happening, but we shouldn't do anything about it. That's 100% refusal. And this goes down to lower levels. Incidentally, roughly 40% of the population think it can't be a problem because Jesus is coming in another couple of decades.
I mean, you've called the Republican Party the most dangerous organization on earth.
In human history. There has never, it's an outrageous statement, and when I said it, I said, look, this is a very outrageous statement, but is it true?
But you're rating them worse than the Kim Jong-un of North Korea or ISIS, who are very...
Is ISIS dedicated to trying to destroy the prospects for organized human existence?
Right? Is that bad, the Republican
what
Party?
does it mean to say not only we're not doing anything about climate change, but we're trying to accelerate the race to the precipice?
And you don't entertain the possibility that they may be genuine in their belief that this is...
Doesn't matter whether they genuinely believe it or not. The people who genuinely believe that Christ is coming in their lifetimes do genuinely believe it. But if the consequence of that is, let's use more fossil fuels, let's refuse to subsidize developing countries, let's eliminate regulations that reduce greenhouse gas emissions, if that's the consequence, that's extremely dangerous. Unless you're living under a rock, you have to recognize the seriousness of this threat. The other threat is nuclear weapons, and they're very dangerous as well.
I don't want to go into too much detail. I think it's more the style of argument that I'm getting at now.
Well, see, I think the style of argument should be that we should tell the truth about important things. And for each of us, and this is an elementary moral principle, the most important thing for each of us is the predictable consequences of our own actions. It's very easy to condemn the crimes of others. So, Stalinist hacks condemned the crimes of the West. I don't applaud them for that. I applaud the Soviet dissidents who condemned the crimes of the Soviet Union. And it's the same for each of us, in individual life or anywhere else.
But Noam Chomsky's world is a black and white world when it comes to the United States. You constantly focus upon what you regard as the evils done, the crimes committed by the United States.
For a reason.
What about the good things that the United States does? What about the reasons which drive millions of people from the poorest parts of this planet to want to live in the United States, to be American?
In the richest country in the world, yeah. And I'm glad my parents came here, otherwise they would have been in death camps. But sure, that's true. And in fact, what you say is not, and just consider these last few minutes of discussion. One of the things that I did was praise the United States, praise it for the significant changes that civilized the society substantially in the last 40 years, coming from popular activism. Or take, say, freedom of speech, which I talk about all the time. It's one of the highest values. It's protected in the United States beyond any country in the world that I know of. It's a major achievement. It doesn't go back to the Bill of Rights. It substantially comes from the Civil Rights Movement. The major Supreme Court cases establishing a high standard of freedom of speech were in connection with civil rights movement actions. So yes, there are very great things that have happened. I talk about them all the time. They come primarily from popular activism, which is directed against the crimes of the country. In fact, I'm struck by the changes in the last 40 years, which have come from an organized, active public, much of it initiated by young people, students and others, and it's had a huge effect.
But it hasn't affected the basic power structures in your view.
No, it has not affected the institutions, but it's affected the way they act. And that's quite important. Opposition to the Iraq War, for example, was far higher than opposition to the Vietnam War at any comparable stage. And it's had an impact. In Iraq, it was bad enough, but the U.S. and Britain could not do what they did in Vietnam. The population would never have tolerated it. Yes, those are important changes.
Okay, well, tell me more, and then we'll come to some of the criticisms that you have made about American imperialism and the like.
See, we have to make a distinction between state power and a country. They're different things.
I understand the difference.
But it's often not distinguished. If you criticize state policy, you're not criticizing a country.
I understand that, too. I mean, frequently when you're traveling around the world, as I do, people say, I love, America, I'm just having a great... I hate the policy. Sure.
And we're responsible for the policy. It's a free country. We can't say, I don't have any responsibility for the policy, because we do. We may not know about it, but then we should find out about it. And if we decide we don't like it, we should change it. In fact, take a look at the question we've just been discussing, two-state settlement. Right. About 2/3 of the American population supports the international consensus on this, and long
Which is there ought to be a two-state solution.
Roughly the 67 borders. Right. And it's kind of interesting to look at the polls. I mean, polls you find roughly 2/3 of the population saying, yeah, they support that. And roughly the same proportion says the U.S. ought to become more involved in the diplomacy. people don't know that that's a contradiction. The reason that that program has not been achieved is because of consistent U.S. intervention to prevent it from being achieved. And that continues at this very moment, in fact. Okay, it is a free country. We've got a lot of freedom. That means people have the opportunity to discover its work. You know, it's not going to come easily. It's where the internet is helpful. They have the opportunity to discover the relevant facts and background which should show them that their position is contradictory. They must come to understand what the U.S. government role has been over the years in preventing the outcome that they want.
Okay. Do you in the end then, if in fact, accept the premise that people get, for the most part in a democracy, people get the government they deserve?
No, I don't.
You don't?
No, in fact,
and you, because you believe, well, let me finish. Because you believe the political process is corrupt.
It's not corrupt.
It's what?
Look.
See, whenever anybody says "look" to me, I know they're saying
it's not that simple.
Right.
I mean, it's not that there's robbery and stealing of elections. There is a distribution of power internal to the country, enormous disparity of economic and other power, and that influences everything that happens in dramatic ways. So many issues simply don't come up in elections.
So the haves have more power than the have-nots, and therefore
overwhelmingly.
they're able to exercise
it. In fact, if you really look closely, elections, they restrict themselves to issues on which the population, they eliminate issues where the mass of the population opposes a lead opinion, systematically.
What state does function according to what you call the minimal levels of honesty? Is there a state?
None. States are power centers. The only thing that imposes constraints on them is either outside force or their own populations. So the United States...
Internal criticism,
yes,
critical dialogue.
That's exactly why the intellectuals who we're talking about are so adamant at preventing people in the United States and Britain from learning the most elementary facts about themselves.
But is it even possible then? If you say no state functions,
it's
like
not
there's
only
no
possible,
nation
it happens. The United States, for example, is far more civilized than it was 40 years ago. Let's just take that. This March happened to be the 40th anniversary of the public announcement by the Kennedy administration that the U.S. Air Force is bombing South Vietnam. It also initiated chemical warfare to destroy crops, initiated napalm, started driving millions of people into concentration camps to separate them from the guerrillas who they knew they were supporting. This was all public. Did we commemorate the 40th anniversary? No. Why? Because 40 years ago, nobody cared. If the government announces, okay, we're going to start bombing another country and use chemical warfare to wipe out their crops and drive them to concentration camps, fine, not a problem. So there was no protest and no discussion.
But now there's more protest and discussion.
Yes, because the country has gotten more civilized. No U.S. president today, or for the last 20 years, could conceivably do what Kennedy could do with total impunity 40 years ago. And the reason is because there was massive popular protest opposed by the intellectual classes, of course, who hate it. But it led to all sorts of things, including opposition to aggression and violence. It also spawned the contemporary civil rights movement, the feminist movement, the environmental movements, and all sorts of other things. And it imposed important constraints on straight violence. In fact, that's how we got rid of slavery. That's how we got rid of feudalism. That's how every step of...
So are we moving towards an emancipation from these things?
Slowly.
You're optimistic?
Yes. Over time, there has been agonizingly slow progress, but very real, always opposed by the intellectuals who support violence and atrocities and try to justify them and try to prevent the population from knowing about them. But fortunately, their control is limited, and therefore...
What will the state look like at the end?
At the end?
Yeah.
The end is a long time.
Okay, but I mean,
what
would we look like?
At the end, I think states ought to dissolve, because I think they're illegitimate structures. But that's a long time.
That's it.
But
it is the end of the nation state that you foresee in the vision.
I don't foresee anything. What I'm saying is that as long as people, ordinary people, are able to free themselves from the doctrinal controls imposed on them by their self-appointed betters and mentors, as long as they're able to do this, they'll continue to be able to struggle for peace and justice and freedom and limitations on violence and constraints on power, as they've been doing for hundreds of years, and I don't see any end to that. Where it'll end up in the long run, I can tell you where I'd like it to, but I wouldn't even dream about that. The immediate problem is to free ourselves from the shackles imposed very consciously by the kind of people you're talking about, who don't want the facts to be known, and for very good reasons, because if people know the facts, they're not going to tolerate them. So therefore you have to prevent them from knowing. You have to indoctrinate them. You have to tell them stories about how we're really good guys, and if we use violence, it must be for the general good because we represent the course of history. Yeah, that's the job of propagandists for power and violence. And it's the task of populations to free themselves from those kinds of controls and domination.
You know, why haven't we seen in the United States more success by a powerful coalition, essentially coming from the left, but not necessarily defined by what the conception, traditional conventional wisdom might be of the left, of labor, minorities, poor,
we have
black
seen
and white.
We have seen it.
What was it the last time you saw it?
A number of times. We saw it in the 60s. That's where the Great Society programs come from. We saw it in the 30s. That's where the New Deal comes from. And in fact, this is a battle that goes back to the origins of American history. You know, the original constitutional framework, the way Madison...
The author of the Great Society programs was Lyndon Johnson.
That's right. And the programs are not initiated by leaders. That's a serious misunderstanding.
Well, those programs were initiated primarily by people who actually, many of them who'd served with FDR.
See, that's a serious misinterpretation, I believe, of the way the political system works. Leaders may sign their names and they may push programs, but they do it because a popular constituency is compelling them to do it. That's the way changes take place. I mean, if there's a large-scale popular movement and there are pressures, there'll be somebody who'll say, I'm your leader.
But,
I'll sign
since
it.
You've made the Great
And
Society...
what happened in this, the programs that came out of the so-called Great Society were the result of popular ferment and activism and changes that were taking place, significant changes that were taking place in the 1960s, which very much democratized the society.
Yep.
And it led to these programs. Since then, there's been an enormous counterattack from business sectors trying to beat it back. And that's the course of history.
I'm just an ordinary mom who just thinks in terms of, I don't want to someday be holding my grandchildren and watching something horrible happen and feel like I didn't do anything. And I mean, it's obvious what you're doing. And my question is, on a practical level, where do you see the most practical place to put your energy? I mean, tonight I feel overwhelmed, like I feel like it's too big, it's too much to even make a dent in.
The way things change is because lots of people are working all the time. And, you know, they're working in their communities or in their workplace or wherever they happen to be, and they're building up the basis for popular movements which are going to make changes. That's the way everything has ever happened in history, you know, whether it was the end of slavery or whether it was the democratic revolutions or anything you want, you name it, that's the way it worked. You get a very false picture of this from the history books. In the history books, there's a couple of leaders, you know, George Washington or Martin Luther King or whatever. And I don't want to say that those people are unimportant, like Martin Luther King was certainly important, but he was not the civil rights movement. Martin Luther King can appear in the history books because lots of people whose names you will never know and whose names are all forgotten and who may have been killed and so on were working down in the South. When you have active activists and people concerned and people devoting themselves and dedicating themselves to social change or issues or whatever, then people like me can appear. And we can appear to be prominent, but that's only because somebody else is doing the work. My work, whether it's giving hundreds of talks a year or spending 20 hours a week writing letters or writing books, is not directed to intellectuals and politicians. It's directed to what are called ordinary people. Yeah. And what I expect from them is, in fact, exactly what they are, that they should try to understand the world and act in accordance with their decent impulses.
and that they should try to improve the world. And many people are willing to do that, but they have to understand. And in fact, as far as I can see, in these things, I feel that I'm simply helping people develop courses of intellectual self-defense.
What did you mean by that? What would such a course be?
I don't mean go to school, because they're not going to get it there. It means you have to develop an independent mind and work on it. Now, that's extremely hard to do alone. You know? The beauty of our system is it isolates everybody. Each person is sitting alone in front of the tube. You know? Now, it's very hard to have ideas or thoughts under those circumstances. You can't fight the world alone. Some people can, but it's pretty rare. The way to do it is through organization. So courses of intellectual self-defense will have to be in the context of political and other organization. And it makes sense, I think, to look at what the institutions are trying to do and to take that almost as a key. What they're trying to do is what we're trying to combat. If they're trying to keep people isolated and separate and and so on, well, we're trying to do the opposite. We're trying to bring them together. So in your local community, you want to have sources of alternative action. People with parallel concerns, maybe differently focused, but at the core, sort of similar values and a similar interest in helping people learn how to defend themselves against external power and taking control of their lives and, reaching out your hand to people who need it. That's a common array of concerns. You can learn about your own values and you can figure out how to defend yourself and so on in conjunction with others.
I think it would be fair to say that you've always had an extraordinary confidence in your own righteousness. And as you enter your 80s, I just wonder, are you as sure about being right now as you ever were?
Yes, but I was never that sure.
Because you come across as extraordinarily sure.
If you have to state an opinion in 2 seconds, it sounds very confident. But I think I mentioned earlier that in the sciences, you have a framework of understanding. You pursue what you think is important, but you maintain in the back of your mind the recognition you may be off on completely the wrong track, and you have to backtrack.
Is that in the back of your mind today?
Always. And if I, for example, you say there's a flood of criticism. Actually, I welcome it and I read it carefully and I look to see if there's anything there that's valid. And with astonishing consistency, there's nothing there, as in the case that you mentioned about the dissent and denazification. The context is always eliminated. When you put the context back in, I think almost any normal person would say that's the right thing to respond.
With all these sort of existential crises, if you were to put yourself in the body of a 20-something-year-old growing up today, how would that shape your sort of life decisions with these two crises?
If I was 20 years old?
Yeah.
Pretty much the way it did when I was, 16 years old, on August 6th, 1945. I happened to be a junior counselor in a summer camp, and the news was reported in the morning, broadcast everyone, atomic bomb wiped out Hiroshima, everyone went on to their next activity, baseball game or whatever it was. I didn't know how to react. I just left, went off into the woods, sat there for a couple hours thinking, what does all this mean? And afterwards decided, look, you just have to devote your life to this. And I think we're in a worse situation now. And there's plenty that can be done. The opportunities are far greater now than they were in the past, thanks to what's been done by people like you in earlier years, like MIT, to say, you could never get an audience like this 20 or 30 years ago. In fact, in the 1960s, MIT was a very conservative campus. Almost nothing was going on. About a dozen undergraduates just changed the place enormously. And it's been very different ever since. And that's happened all around the country, which means that you have a legacy that you can build on. Plenty of challenges, but plenty of opportunities. And the question is, do you decide to grasp them or not?
Would you like what's said about you to be your political arguments or your contribution to the theory of linguistics?
tell you the honest truth, I really don't care.
You don't care?
I mean, I'd like to see people follow up on the things that are interesting and important and productive and forget about the things that were byways and mistakes and so on. But if my name is attached to it or not.
But what then would you characterize as most important in your judgment, if you were?
Well, I mean, I played a certain role in reshaping the fields concerned with human intellectual faculties, cognitive sciences in particular, linguistics. Some of it has been extremely productive. Not me, it's a cooperative enterprise. And that's often running on its own.
Right.
In the political domain, I would like to see people energized, participating, thinking for themselves, not subordinating themselves to systems of discipline and propaganda, either in the structure of life, and there's plenty of that, or in the doctrinal domains. So if people can come to use the capacities that they in fact have and the opportunities they in fact have to overcome systems of authority, illegitimate authority, domination, hierarchy, free themselves, think through issues for themselves, not the way they're taught to conform, and do something about it. That's the best legacy I can imagine.
Well, one characteristic that makes us unique is that we can determine the course of our own history. Horses and cows and dogs can't do that. They are essentially passive victims of whatever happens. But we can make the decisions that will determine the course that history will follow. Actually, we have made choices which at this present moment are destroying other species at a rate that hasn't been seen for 65 million years, when a huge asteroid hit the Earth and ended the age of the dinosaurs and opened the way for small mammals to develop, ultimately us. We're now killing other species at the same rate as that huge asteroid explosion. So we have already made a decision for a huge number of others, and we're in a position to make the decision for ourselves. Other species can't do this. Partly this has to do with unique cognitive capacities that human beings have. So, for example, you and I can have this discussion, but two lions can't have that discussion. We have the cognitive capacities that enable us to do it. They don't. And out of this flows many other things. But the crucial one for us to pay attention to is our ability to determine what the future will be. And it's an extremely serious question right now, the kind of question which literally has never arisen in history.